Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Salva. I'm the president of Yale University, and welcome to this semester's President's Women of Yale lecture, although we're not actually going to have a lecture. We're going to have a conversation. But last fall, we began this series as a way to showcase the accomplishments of women who graduated from Yale. And we've had a particular focus on women of color. Our guests include our distinguished speaker today, Anita Hill, and they represent the very best of this university. They reflect on the remarkable success of women who have studied at Yale in the college since coeducation and in the professional and graduate schools for much, much longer. It was, in fact, the idea of my wife, Marta Moret, herself a woman of Yale, a 1984 graduate of the School of Public Health, who first proposed the idea that we should have a speaker series that would bring some of Yale's most inspiring women back to campus. I hope some of you were with us for earlier talks. Our first speaker in the series was Maya Lin, the pioneering architect and artist who graduated from Yale College in 1981. She earned her master's from the School of Architecture in 1986, returned to Yale a year later, and received an honorary degree of Fine Arts. Many of you, of course, know the Women's Table. The sculpture in front of the library is Maya Lin, and of course, everyone knows the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Earlier this year, we welcomed Vera Wells, a member of the class of 1971, the first Yale College. She was in the first Yale College graduating class to include women, and she told us a very compelling story about the first tenured woman of color on our faculty. We're approaching the 50th anniversary of coeducation in Yale College, and each of these events in the President's Women of Yale Lecture Series is a way to honor the remarkable contribution of our alumni. In 2019, we will get to that anniversary year, and we will host a major celebration of coeducation at Yale. It's a milestone that I'm very excited about, and I know you are as well. But that's the 50th anniversary of coeducation in Yale College. It's also important to recognize that women have studied at Yale far longer than that. It goes back nearly 150 years, and in fact, in that very same year, 2019, we will celebrate 150 years of women studying in the graduate and professional schools since 1869. The journey for women to gain access to the highest rungs of higher education has not been easy, and women of color have faced even greater barriers. In 1939, Jane Bolin became the first African-American woman to graduate from the Yale Law School. At age 31, the mayor of New York appointed her to a judgeship in the city's domestic relations court, making her the first female African-American judge in the United States. In his announcement, Mayor LaGuardia praised Bolin for translating her knowledge and understanding into useful public service. Much could be said of our guest, much the same could be said of our guest today. Anita Hill received her JD from the Yale Law School in 1980. Following graduation, she worked in private practice and then at the U.S. Education Department and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In 1989, she became the first African-American to be tenured at the University of Oklahoma College of Law. She then became a professor at Brandeis, rising to university professor of law, public policy, and women's studies, and teaching courses on gender, race, social policy, and legal history. As counsel to the law firm Cohen & Milstein, she advises on class action workplace discrimination cases. Her scholarly accomplishments include editing the volume Race, Gender, and Power in America, The Legacy of the Hill-Thomas Hearings, and authoring an autobiography, Speaking Truth to Power. Her most recent writings include the book Reimagining Equality, Stories of Gender, Race, and Finding Home, which I've been reading this week, which among a series of interrelated topics from the play Raisin in the Sun, to which is kind of an ongoing metaphor or analogy throughout the book, to what happened in the city of Baltimore, to stories of her own family and others like them. The book really focuses on the American dream, the dream of a home and of home ownership in particular, and how it's been challenged and compromised most recently in the fall of 2008 and in 2009 by the Great Recession, the credit crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis, and how all of these issues of home and home ownership interrelate to concerns of race, gender, and class. In 2015, Anita Hill was recognized as a university professor by the Brandeis University Board of Trustees. This year, she is on leave visiting MIT, experiencing a different home environment, I guess I would say. As you know, she is a dedicated advocate for the rights of women. Her testimony before the U.S. Senate during the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court confirmation hearings made her a national symbol of the challenges women, particularly women of color, face in this country. Since then, she has continued to work to end sexual harassment and workplace discrimination. Her public advocacy and scholarship help us to understand how gender and race interact to form potent barriers to success for girls and women. And today, I am just honored and proud to welcome to Yale, back to Yale, Anita Hill, one of the truly outstanding women of Yale University.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
So our format today, and we in this lecture series, we keep trying different formats to see what works best. I'm going to ask Professor Hill some questions, and she will speak to them. And then we have questions from all of you that should be on 3x5 cards, and once they make their way up here, sorted out by not by how controversial or non-controversial they are, but rather by how legible they are. But we'll then ask some questions that you all submitted. So let me start with a little bit of an autobiographical question about your time here at Yale. Obviously, the Yale School of Law, the Yale Law School, is a unique and interesting environment in and of itself. And I'd be very interested, and I know everyone here would be very interested in hearing whether the experience here was formative for you in some way, and just how things have evolved since those days at the Yale Law School.
Well, I will say that when I applied to law school, I applied to several law schools, as most people do, and I thought I wanted to go to Harvard. And then I visited Harvard, and I decided I really wanted to go to Yale. And one of the reasons that I wanted to go to Yale was a guy named Jim Thomas, who was the dean. I think I may have a couple of law school classmates here. Marilyn is one of them. I came to Yale Law School in 1977. And it really was, to me, like walking into an alien space. Not only because I had never really experienced life out of Oklahoma and that part of the world, but the way of learning and the concepts were really quite alien to me. And I had to figure out exactly how I was going to embrace it. It was, you had mentioned that the professional schools had had women for a while. In my law school class, there were about 30% of the class were women. And that was significant. It didn't feel so strange as some of the early years, I think, of having women in the college were. But it was still, that wasn't the alien part. I did feel that there were a critical number of women. There were fewer percentage-wise of people of color. As a matter of fact, in my class, I think there were 12 African Americans and 11 of them were women. And so in Maryland, is one graduate in 1980 with me. And so how to figure out, how does someone from Oklahoma, there may have been two people in the entire building from Oklahoma, who is African American, who is female, come into this space that's been traditionally space for wealthy white males. And by the way, I was from a farm in Oklahoma. So it was a quite unique experience for me. And what I found was that if I was ever going to grasp these alien concepts, was that I would have to, in fact, embrace and find some things that were familiar. And to ground myself in the things that I knew and felt comfortable with in order to be able to expand and to grow. And I was able to do that by making some really incredible friendships with a lot of people, but in particular the African American students, to be able to have an organization like BALSA, Black Law Students Association, as a support system and as sort of a friendship system, but also a professional organization. To be able to, we had to kind of connect with other women in the class. And at that point, once I did that, I was able to really embrace the experience. But I had to start with the things that were familiar in order to be able to expand out. And the more support systems that I could have had, we didn't have a lot then, but those that were there were really quite effective. And so it was then possible for me to, I look back at some of the things that I did. I was in a clinic for children and representing children with Steve. Judith Resnick is here, and so and Denny Curtis as well. But I was able to be a class officer. I was able to do moot court. I was able to do all of the things that you can do in law school that makes the experience better, but only because I had that base that I could always go back to and that would make me feel supported and welcome. And I was really, I think that helped me here, and it allowed me to be comfortable and also successful and to graduate. I might have otherwise been back in Oklahoma quite early.
So to ask a question that I think must be on everyone's mind. Your testimony before Congress 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago now, was an incredibly brave act that changed, that in many ways changed the national conversation about sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. But my guess is you probably view some things as having changed and some things not as having changed since that time. And I'd be really interested in your take on women in the workplace now versus then. And have we made progress, and in what ways?
The 26-year slice is an interesting era, I think, from 1991 to look at. But I think I want to kind of give a shout out to some of my fellow Yale graduates on the issue of sexual harassment. In 1975, a graduate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, was the first woman. She graduated in 1964, I believe. Was the first person ever to hold public hearings on the issue of sexual harassment. About the same time, Catherine McKinnon started laying the legal groundwork for sexual harassment. to actually come to the courts and be able to raise a claim, and what were the strategies, and how was it going to work, and what was the argument for it being covered by Title VII. I testified in 1991, and in 2014, Catherine Lehman, who is a 1996 graduate, I believe, was the person who wrote a second set of guidelines for colleges and universities on Title IX to deal with the issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault on campuses. So one of the things that I have to say, and I don't know that much has been made of this, but the women at Yale Law School have actually had, I believe, a real impact and made the idea of sexual harassment something really tangible and real. And I think it's important for us to look at where we've come, not starting in 1991, but really starting in 1975, when Eleanor Holmes Norton really had the temerity to do these hearings about a subject that few people were even paying any attention to. And Catherine McKinnon was developing a legal strategy for how to move forward in the courts on these claims. My testimony really was bringing some of these issues and awareness to the public consciousness and making it part of the public discussion. And then Catherine Lehman, who has really sort of made real that public discussion in guidelines and for colleges and universities to actually start to do something about these issues. I also have to point out that 3 of those women are women of color. So I think that it's important for us to say, well, where were we then and where are we now? But I think we also have to look at different kinds of milestones. Where we were in 1991, after my testimony, I cannot tell you how many people I heard from who didn't even know that sexual harassment was against the law. Yeah. It was just something that happened to them. They didn't know that there was something that some way to call it out, and certainly didn't know that there was a way to challenge it. And I think, that's the real shame of the legal profession, because we have this problem that had been well documented by the surveys that was happening to women every day in the workplaces and throughout, every sector, and that they didn't know that they had rights to make it stop, that they had the right to be in a workplace that was free of harassment. And so I started wondering why that was, and that's when I left law teaching and went into policy school. But to get from that point in 1991 to where we are now, where we have this part of this huge public conversation, I think is quite significant. So how did we get there? One, in 1991, people started filing complaints in record numbers. They stepped up because they, even the pundits said, oh, nobody's going to come forward now because they've seen how badly you were treated, and nobody wants to be treated in that way. I mean, and the assumption behind that was that everybody should expect to be treated badly when they raise a sexual harassment claim. And that's not far from the truth, because unfortunately, there's still a great deal of retaliation for women who against women who file sexual harassment complaints. In fact, about 60% or more will be retaliated against. But so the record numbers of people filing EEOC complaints after 1991, there was actually a change in the law that allowed for the first time women to recover fully for their injury when they were sexually harassed. They had there was one Supreme Court case, that was a 1986 case, one major case in the Supreme Court on sexual harassment by 1991. Now we have a fuller body of law, some of it problematic, I think, and unhelpful to, and really unrealistic in terms of some of the constraints that are put on people filing complaints and holding employers liable. But we've got a stronger grounding in the law. We started to raise awareness. One of the things that happened after 1991 was that people started sharing their stories with their family members that had not been done before. And I think that's absolutely something that's significant that we kind of don't think of as that important. But when you're talking about changing public awareness and public consciousness, one of the best things that can happen is that people tell their stories to people who care about them and who they care about. So those things have all happened, but as we know from the headlines lately, it's not over. And so now we have a new wave of a new generation of women. But I have to tell you that I think that at every decade, whether it was in the 70s when those pioneer women were filing sexual harassment complaints and they were just being, some of them were being told that these were personal matters and not legal matters. Some of the cases were rejected. Finally, you had a Supreme Court decision validating their positions. From the 70s to the 90s, when those women came forward after the hearings, despite what people told them that they wouldn't be heard, to the years after and raising a generation of young women to understand that sexual harassment was illegal and that it was wrong. I think all of those brought us to where we are today. So that you now have people coming forward, telling their stories, whether it is to the press or on social media. And I think that much of that attention that is going on now is because the press has gotten better. The press has gotten better. We've, when in 1991, over and over again, and even in the years since then, people have said, well, why don't women come forward? I mean, even though we're living examples of why they don't come forward, because people keep asking you why you don't come forward, even though you tell them over and over again. But when we see why women don't come forward, because they get bruised and battered and re-injured in coming forward. And we're now moving, it seems, at least in the public conversation, beyond that question. And we're looking at not only the behavior, which is egregious and horrific in some of the cases that we've heard about, whether it's Roger Ailes or Harvey Weinstein or James Toback. I mean, all of these behaviors, we're focusing on that. But I think we're also focusing on something that is much more important. And that is the structures and the people and the systems that enable it. And that is a breakthrough. To have the public discussion talking about, well, how do people get away with it? Not how do women, why don't women come forward, but how do you get away with it? In Harvey Weinstein's situation for 3 decades. And what we're starting to see is that there are particular structures, and I use Harvey Weinstein almost as a case study. I know some of the things he said he didn't do, some of the things he says that he admits to doing. But I'm sure in different places outside of Hollywood, you will find Harvey Weinsteins. And they may not make movies and they may not be as wealthy as he is, but they behave in some of the same ways. Well, you've got contract terms. You've got a board of directors that ignores the flags. You've got what I call gag orders when settlements are reached. You have these non-disclosure clauses in the contracts of people who are employees who cannot talk about what they see in the workplace. And you have arbitration clauses in some circumstances where people cannot adjudicate their claims so that no one knows that these claims even exist. You also have people who are sort of passed along, even if maybe someone does get punished and moved out of a system. They get moved into another system. And nobody knows that they have been engaging in sexual harassment. And that happens a lot in the academy. And so you've got that sort of first layer of protections that kind of set up a shield around the harasser that allows them to continue. And we're starting to understand that. But one of the things that Harvey Weinstein's situation also points out is that there's sort of a secondary level of protections that come when people give you awards and acknowledgments and recognitions because you're a powerful person and they want to be associated with that power, or for whatever reason they're looking at the position. And those are used to kind of fend off any accusations. And those are typically going to be the men. They're not going to be the women who are the accusers, who have these kinds of accolades that sort of give them the sort of stamp of approval. Harvey Weinstein is one example. Roger Ailes was seen as a genius. Bill Cosby was seen as America's father. Not long ago, Yale Law School gave Clarence Thomas their highest honor. So, and before then, they had given it to Bill Clinton. So we have to ask, all of us have to ask ourselves, are we enablers? Are we participating in it when we ignore these stories that we've heard about people and then give them big awards that, in a sense, give them a little bit of cover and maybe in some cases a lot of cover for bad behavior. So we're just now, I think, starting to get to all of those things, but that's where we are. Yeah.
So you just traced the kind of individual standing alone to the larger social context that enables it. It makes me want to follow up with a little bit of a personal question. When I look at the situation today, the one that is in the news today, this week, versus you more than 25 years ago, you didn't have the context of #MeToo, right? People coming forward and supporting each other, and essentially a movement developing around people coming public, stating in public, this also happened to me, at least not at all to the extent that we're now seeing, in the Weinstein case. And so I guess my question is, this must have taken an incredible act of courage to do it alone. Yes, you mentioned the great legal minds who worked on these issues and created a way forward, but you had to decide yourself that I was going to come forward and talk about this in Congress, in front of people who are going to be quite hostile to it, in front of a media that didn't really understand the issue. And how did you muster the courage to do it?
I don't know that I had any idea of exactly what it was going to be like. And I'm looking at Judith Resnick right now because I think I was able to come forward in a lot of ways. I knew I would have the support of my family, but I also had the support of my colleagues in law teaching, and Judith was one of those. There was Emma Colden Jordan, there was Charles Ogletree, all of these people who sort of said, look, we're going to help you get through this, when I had nobody really who was sort of thinking about. I was just sort of thrust in. And I had less than a week to prepare. And so this group of people who had been colleagues actually stepped up. I did have the benefit of law teaching, although this was not my area of teaching, but I do think that was helpful. I had a wonderful family. I had great colleagues and supporters in my profession. And I had supporters at the law school that I was in. And beyond that, I just thought, you know, I was a law teacher telling students every year, you know, this is a system that you want to value and believe in, and you want it to have integrity. And for me, the integrity of the court was at stake. And and the profession, you know, is only as sound as its highest representative. And so that's what I was thinking of. The commitment that I made to myself. I also, you know, I grew up, I was born in 1956, just after the Brown versus Board of Education, when schools were starting to open up, and opportunities were opening up, and I know how significant the law is and how much it can mean in the lives of people. And when you're on the court, and even one member can change the trajectory of the law and a decision, and, you know, and there are 5-4 decisions now all the time. So I think we've, you know, it was all of those things. Maybe I wasn't consciously thinking, oh, this is a really brave thing to do, but I was thinking it was the right thing to do. And so that's how I managed to do it, knowing that it was the right thing to do, that what I had to say went to the character and fitness of Clarence Thomas to be on the court, and that it was not just about Clarence Thomas, but it was about the court and the decisions that were going to be coming out of the court now for 26 years. Mm-hmm. So it was, I think back now and I ask myself, would I do it again? And my answer is yes, yeah. I would do it again. But I don't think I had really any idea what I was getting into the first time. But I would do it again. Yeah. And I would do it again because it was the right thing to do. And it was also not just the right thing to do, but what I didn't really understand was that our voices were not being heard. Women's voices and experiences were not being valued. And that process just showed me that we weren't being valued in our processes. Our real experience, our lived experiences weren't being listened to, that we had senators who said, oh, well, I have no idea about this sexual harassment stuff. What does it mean? I mean, they went from, oh, it doesn't exist, to the person who does it would have to be a monster. I mean, they were just sort of all over the place in terms of their lack of understanding. And then you think, well, if they don't understand this about our experiences, do they really represent us? Mm-hmm. And I think that's why the hearings had such a political impact. None of that was what I intended. But I've come to understand that why it was important for me to be there, beyond the fact that I just believe that the court was important and that my testimony went directly to character and, I like to say, unfitness to be on the Supreme Court.
Your comments right now, I was going to ask you, by the way, if you had any regrets. There is no trace of regret in your answer or your voice. It's interesting to hear the certainty with which you said that. I was going to ask you, when you were just making a comment about the inability, in this case, of members of Congress to understand the experience that people have every day, unfortunately. And that puts me in the mind of another brave Yale law student, someone who was a doctoral student at the Yale Law School a number of years before you were a student at the law school, and that's Pauli Murray. You probably know that we named a college for Pauli Murray not too far from here, a couple blocks from here, just earlier this academic year. In fact, about 3 weeks ago, we dedicated Pauli Murray College. And Pauli Murray coined the phrase Jane Crow to describe a kind of double discrimination that women of color, particularly black women, she was really speaking more broadly to women of color, experience in this in our country. And that issue is of current interest to our students in recent years and in scholarly writings as well. And I'm wondering, from your view, how far have we come with respect to double discriminations of this kind, and do they represent a kind of unique difficulty that needs to be addressed in its own right and not necessarily as part of something else?
Well, I do believe that, back to the hearings just quickly, I did experience a sort of double discrimination where Clarence Thomas was allowed to represent the race, and I was allowed to represent gender. And so the question was whether or not he deserved really to be able to represent the race, given the fact that I too am African American. But the public really didn't have a narrative for the experiences of African American women, especially they had the lynching narrative that is so appalling and so even now present in our society. There's ideas around the elimination of people through just public executions. But they didn't have or hadn't been taught the history of the sexual violence against African American women, or they didn't want to understand it, so that they could say that that is part of the racial narrative. And in some ways that is, how that's part of what Pauli Murray was talking about, that not in the specifics of gendered violence, but there is a really good essay, I think, on the difference that my race made, that's written by Leon Higginbotham, that I recommend to you. Any of you who know Leon Higginbotham also knows he's a Yale graduate. I do know people who aren't Yale Law School graduates. But he's a particularly special one who wrote a really sort of deconstructing the whole scene. What would happen if I had been white and Clarence Thomas were who he is? And I use an example. This is not his, but my example is that what would Strom Thurmond have done? Would he have embraced him? And I think that is part of what is so. Now that's 1991. Pauli Murray was talking about what we now call intersectionality back in the 1960s. I mean, that to me is something that we don't give Pauli Murray enough credit for, one, being influential in the race movement and in the women's movement, singular in each one of those places, but also really theorizing them enough to understand where some people were falling out of both of those movements. And for her case, it was women of color. I mean, one person who does give Pauli Murray credit, as you know, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in terms of her work that she did for the ACLU. But mostly she's not recognized either as a theorist or as an organizer, and she was both. She was just incredibly inquisitive and questioning of the way things are, to the extent that she even questioned her own gender identity. I mean, she had the kind of mind that just sort of pushed everything. I know secondhand because she was a teacher of a colleague of mine at Brandeis, and that was her nature. That was who she was, to always be pushing and pressing and trying to get the answers. When she talked about intersectionality, or what has become intersectionality, and she called it Jane Crow, she did it in a speech that was given to the National Conference of Negro Women in 1963. And she did it in response to the fact that African American women's voices were excluded from the March on Washington, that they had been involved in a lot of the work of the civil rights movement. They'd been doing the groundwork, but they were not given speaking roles at that march. And I guess to add insult to injury, the organizers, the male organizers on the day or so after the march went to the press club, Washington Press Club, for a breakfast. And it was no women were allowed. So, she saw these inconsistencies in the way A. Philip Randolph was actually interpreting equality. And she sort of laid out the different ways that people had thought that, if we give African American men jobs, that women will benefit and that will be enough. And she was saying, well, there are African American women who are qualified and could benefit from the job, and the entire race would benefit. And I think we've come to that now. We understand that now. But she also saw problems with the women's rights movement, that African American women were not included in that. She was talking about the gender-race pay disparities in 1963. So all of these things, for me, really were just so far ahead of their time. Are we truly understanding now what it means? What intersectionality means? It's gotten disparaged by a lot of theorists, legal theorists, and I happen to have spent some time with Kimberly Crenshaw, who is now really devoting most of her work to intersectionality. So she's starting to look at how it plays out in structures and systems against women of color, and especially when it comes to gendered violence. But let me just give you a couple of examples. One is in the academy, and one of the things that we are finding is that Asian American women in the last 10 or so years have been denied tenure at a much higher rate than other candidates. And there sort of seems to have been a wave of these denials of tenure that don't seem to be explained by anything other than kind of this concept of, of race and gender combining, moving or disadvantaging them. But the other piece of it is, if you think about finding if you're an African American woman or an Asian woman, and you're filing a discrimination suit, the employer can defend that discrimination suit by saying, well, I'm not discriminating against women because I've hired many women. Or they can defend against that by saying, well, I've hired a number of Asian men. And there is no clear path to claim that you are discriminating on the basis of both race and gender in those cases. There are arguments that have been made, but it hasn't been declared as sort of covered under the existing legal structures. And so those are the kinds of things that we're still experiencing, I call them these big gaps in the law in terms of how do we deal with intersectional issues. And so we're not there yet. There has been no big pronouncement about how to deal with that case where, well, they hired Asian men, so they can't be discriminating against Asians. But there's also an interesting study that's out. I find it interesting anyway, because I'm at MIT now. But it's a study of women of color astronomers. And what they found was that, and it was a study about harassment, they found that women of color astronomers were more likely to be sexually harassed than white women astronomers. But they also found that they were more likely to be racially harassed than male astronomers who are men of color. So the question is, how do you treat that? How do we think about that, and why is that happening? Doesn't seem to be completely gender, nor does it seem to be completely race. It's both. And how does the law recognize that in a system that really looks at categories individually? So we're not there in terms of the law, and I don't think we're there in terms of culturally understanding what Jane Crow or its modern day iterations are.
So let's go with the MIT comment that you just made. And not talk about MIT per se, but talk about the tech industry. You just wrote recently an op-ed piece for the New York Times where you talked about a pay gap and a promotion gap that women face in the tech industry. And I'm wondering if you would share some of your thoughts about the technology sector and what's happening. We do hear a little bit about the interest in Silicon Valley and addressing the challenge, although it's not clear that progress is being made in it with any rapidity.
Well, it seems to me that the problem now that we look at all of these big scandals, whether it's Uber or Tesla or the problems with venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, that what we see is this sort of new economy replicating some of the traditions of the old. There are three things that I think are problematic, not just the pay gap, but the pay gap, the lack of leadership, the gender diversity and racial diversity in leadership. And I always tell my policy students, if you discover gender discrimination, keep looking, because you're going to find race too. Or you're going to find sexual identity discrimination, or you're going to find disability. You're going to find some other discrimination. But so there's the pay gap, there's the lack of leadership and the diversity, and then this toxic harassment culture that exists. So all of those things come together, and they're interrelated, and it's like you cannot deal with one without dealing with all of them. And so we really don't quite know where to start. If we look at some of the pay gap issues, you've got women under the age of 25 who are making 29% less than their counterparts. Women who go in and negotiate a salary are 63% more likely to get less money than the men negotiating a salary. The problem with that is that what it says is that this pay gap that we thought we were closing is not closing in this emerging economy. And it's also problematic and troubling because these economies are being run by men, typically, who grew up in an age where women were 40% of the workplace. Most of them had working, or many of them had working mothers. So how is the discrimination so embedded in who they are or in the world that they cannot find their way out of it? Is this the way the future is going to look? And I think that's, to me, why I look at at Silicon Valley and the tech industries. And I'm so troubled by it. It's because we hope that things would change, not because they're liberal and politically liberal and, but because it's new and it's a new generation, and we've been told that this generation doesn't see differences, racial and gender. It's not, they're much more open-minded, but they're not behaving in the way. So I think that this is a moment where we really ought to be looking at scrutiny at Silicon Valley and what's going on out there, and what is it, the culture that is creating this or contributing to it. But what I didn't say in that New York Times piece is something that I think we also have to understand, that it's almost Silicon Valley as a laboratory or a community. And so when we think of Silicon Valley, we tend to think of Silicon Valley as a really highly educated computer scientists, or maybe MBA graduates, many of them MBA graduates from Harvard, who are going out there and running these businesses. But I think we all, and as much as we're concerned about the salaries and pay of the people who work in Google, we need to be also concerned about the salaries and pay of the other people in that community, like the people who take care of the children of the people who work in Google, and the people who are the teachers in that community, that while the tech industry is booming, their salaries aren't booming, and they can't even live in the communities where all of this is going on. So I think we need to start looking at gender equality and equity, not just from a thin slice of the economy, but as a sort of a lateral, but also looking throughout the system that is the tech industry, and looking at how women throughout that system are faring. Mm-hmm. And we haven't quite gotten that figured out too. And I think that, again, is going to be telling of the direction that this country is going in. And especially when we sort of put the tech industry out there as an example of success, of economic success. But we need to be asking our question, the question, economic success for who? Mm. And even if we get equality for the women who are working in the C-suite, is that going to then filter into the rest of the community? And those are the questions that I think are the sort of the bigger questions that we need to have, and use tech as an example.
Yeah. Before we turn to questions from the audience, let me ask one follow-up to that. You expressed some disappointment about the tech industry. Well, you expressed a lot of disappointment about the tech industry, but in particular, the fact that it's young, and that one would have expected that because it's a young industry that where people claim not to see difference or what have you, at least not in a prejudiced way, that the results would be more positive. So let me turn that a little bit on its head. You spent a lot of time talking to students at Brandeis, now at MIT, in front of audiences made up in part of students at universities like Yale and around the country. Is there something that you are hearing in the generation of young people today that gives you more optimism than, say, the tech industry has provided you?
Well, putting those two things together, I think I am optimistic, because I hear, what I hear from students is activism. I mean, we've got activism. The reason that we have many of the movement in colleges and universities against sexual harassment and sexual assault is because of student activism. Young women decided that they were going to move on this issue, that it was important for them, even though some of them had left the schools that they were in. And I don't think I've seen that kind of activism, whether it's gender activism or activism toward racial inclusion, which I've seen over throughout the country. I don't think that's that's by chance. I think we're in that moment now where we can really be happy and satisfied, at least from my point of view, that we're making these movements in progressive directions. Now, I also hear them being very inclusive, that they want to bring in other people in this conversation. They want other leaders. They don't want leaders that just look all the same. They don't want ideas that just come from the same experiences or the same place. They don't want to just cover one issue. They want to cover a range of issues in terms of the progress. Now, the concern I have with really regard to the tech industry is, will that die once they get beyond the college situations and university situations? Will they sort of fall back on old prejudices and old kinds of ways of thinking, the way it seems to have happened with these young leaders in tech? The other thing, though, that I have to say is that we are now experiencing on those campuses, this pushback. And some of the pushback, of course, is coming from outside. Those people who just think that college campuses are all, about liberals. And I mean, I think it was George Will that says it was, sexual assault wasn't real, that it was just about academic progressivism, claiming victimhood as some rarefied state. That you've got pushback from outside. But you also have pushback from inside, that universities are really traditional places, just in case you didn't notice. I mean, then these young people are challenging some traditions that, quite frankly, have outlived their usefulness, in my mind. And that's really hard. And so when you've got those external forces and you have internal forces, when you've got people who say, oh, well, we've gone far enough from the outside, or we've in fact gone too far, and then you have people internally who are really resistant to even looking at their traditions to see if they are still valuable, it's difficult to make change. What I hope is that for young people, that it will always be this experience of trying to make change in universities and then throughout the world will be a learning experience. But it won't, I'm hopeful that it won't kill their spirit and sort of send them out into the world to just accept the status quo.
Right, thank you for that. Somebody I think has a deck of cards for me. And that would be Joy. Okay, thank you. So why don't we turn to a few of your questions. We have 10, 15 minutes, and we can take a few questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So the first few questions are actually people seeking your advice. And let me take them. I guess I'll do them one at a time, but we'll take them. Let me take a look here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to read all three, and then you can jump in on anywhere you want. So, what advice would you give for young women, especially young women of color, aspiring to work in male-dominated spaces like the legal field? Second one is, as a woman of color, what do you hope young girls of color will take away from your story, and how, including Yale, and how you've lived your life? And the last one, what advice do you have for women who actually have experienced gender prejudice of different kinds in the workplace? That was from a staff member. The first two were from students. The general area of advice.
I don't give blanket advice because I know that everyone's situation is unique to their experience and their setting. So I don't say, oh, you have to file a complaint. But what I do tell people is to understand what your situation is in terms of moving toward a complaint, if that is what you're interested in doing. You got to understand the system. You've got to understand what the investigation process is, whether or not you're going to be able to respond to any kind of answers, whether, who's going to be doing the evaluation, who they're going to question, everything, and understand what your own support systems are. And that's kind of advice that I give everybody, is that, just like I started out saying, it was Balsa, it was Black women in my class, it was my friends who kind of knew where Oklahoma was. All of those things were things that helped me to get through it. And whether or not you're going into a male-dominated profession, whether you're going to file a complaint, you really have to go into this with a understanding of how you're going to be supported. Because I haven't ever come across any woman who is my age or even reasonably younger who hasn't needed that support. I haven't run across a person of color who hasn't needed that support because of some of the sometimes open hostilities and sometimes just microaggressions that they experience. And you need somebody that you can be able to talk to about what that is like. So finding that support system, whatever it is, and I'm very fortunate because I had it. I can say I have no regrets now because that's what I have, and that's what I continue to have.
Great. This is a question from a student in the class of 2018. This person says, this room appears to have fewer younger students than most Yale events. I thought it said fewer younger people, and I was going to say present company notwithstanding, but fewer younger students than most Yale events. Do you think, or what do you think young people misunderstand about the history of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment?
I think that people, I'm not surprised that younger people don't have any idea who I am. I'm really not. I'm on a college campus, trust me. And I think that we have a very different idea of what history is, what recent history is, the older we are, than younger people do. But I think I'm probably not the person to ask what young people, why young people are not present or what their understanding is. I think but I would love to have that conversation, not just because I want them to come to see me, but because I think it is important for us to really try to bridge the gaps, to get their sense of, to help really them build on a history. And to know, because I think if they do, they will know that there are people who have been fighting for this, and that there are examples of times when we've actually won, even when it didn't look like we were winning. There are times we have won because we have advanced these issues to the place where it is today, and so where they are today. So I think that is important, and I don't know how to start that conversation, but I'm hopeful that we can, at this point, when we've got so much attention now to the issue of sexual harassment, that we can use this as a moment where we can start to bridge that.
Great. I'm going to do two more because the next two were just really good questions. And
they're all good questions.
They're all good. They're all good. So this is from a student in the class of 2021. Given both your personal and your professional experience with law, do you think policy or law can ever be written to serve specific ideals, to serve the specific ideals it was created for? Or do you think all law ultimately gets warped in a way to serve someone's ideology or different values than those that created it? I guess what the question really is can you ever be idealistic about the law and about the career in law?
Oh, I was thinking the other way around.
Or the other way around.
Are you entirely cynical about the law? I think that one of the things that we've got to understand is that and it keeps you in this business and believing that there are some principles. And I mean, we talk as a country about justice, we talk about equality, we talk about equity. And then you're absolutely right that the law sometimes gets co-opted for other purposes. We've seen that very recently, and we'll probably continue to see it in the next few years. But that doesn't mean that we have to throw away the law. I think that just means that this is a struggle, and it's an ongoing struggle. That it doesn't end, that, you know, those people who said, well, I thought we should have been done with sexual harassment by now. Well, we're talking about centuries upon centuries of behavior that we thought we could overturn in just, 26 years. Well, that doesn't happen, because for every time there's a movement forward, there are people who are going to resist it. And so we just have to be vigilant and to try to keep moving the law in the right direction. I won't give up on the law. And it's not just because I've invested a career in it, but I won't give up on it, but I'm also not going to be satisfied with trying to do it the same way. I do think we have to be imaginative. I think we have to be ever curious. I think Pauli Murray is a great example of that. And I think that we have to think what equality is for a new generation and all of the different elements of it. It's not just about economic equality. It's not just about having the right job or having access to an education. To me, it's about outcomes. It's about how people live their day-to-day lives. And so as long as we keep pushing, as long as we keep imagining, as long as we keep enlarging our sense of what justice is, law will always be able to play an important role.
Right. So our last question, and this comes from an alum who is here, and I'm going to paraphrase it just a little bit. And it has to do with the accusations against Harvey Weinstein and whether they represent some kind of tipping point. Do we think that this case in particular about workplace sexual harassment is somehow different and will be the case that and it's all of its attendant publicity will be the case that really changes things, at least since Clarence Thomas?
Well, I think that I think it's a mistake for us to think that this one case is it. I think we've got to look at the totality of the circumstances. There's not, a magic potion or one incident or one example. What I'm afraid of is that we'll just sort of look and start to so narrow the experiences of the women in Hollywood that we won't start looking at the women waiting tables in the restaurant that you go to, that we won't look at the people who are on factory lines, and we won't look at women throughout employment. And then we sort of so balkanize this behavior that we won't learn the larger lessons. So I would sort of argue against even trying to make Harvey Weinstein the case that will turn everything around. Unless by that you mean it's the case that will allow us to see all other forms of gendered violence and abuse. And if we can look at it that way, if we can look at it as one example that allows us to open our eyes to what's going on historically and today in so many places with so many people, then I think we can make some advances with it. But even then, I don't want people to give up and say, well, I thought Harvey Weinstein was going to do it all, and it's not. We still, as I say, have to continue to be vigilant, and we still have to look for new ways to really get to people's lived experiences and in order to actually put an end to sexual harassment. It's not going to be over If you start to look at Harvey Weinstein as a case, then the solution is, okay, fire Harvey Weinstein. And then you leave a lot of people in a lot of different places stranded because they don't meet the same kind of behavior, or they don't have the same profile, or for any number of reasons. So I think that we've got a whole lot to learn, but we shouldn't think that this is the end.
Can I thank you for such a compelling conversation?
Thank you for your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. There we go.
May I invite you all to a reception that I believe is right outside the